In this video, we're going to take just a few minutes and talk about Cisco boot parameters. We'll talk about every network engineer's favorite friend, the Cisco config register. And we'll also talk about how to tell the router or switch which iOS file to boot. But first, let's start off with the config register. The configuration register is a bitmapped field that is present on every Cisco device. Now, not every Cisco device allows you to change the configuration register. For example, here in my lab, I have 3 switches. I have a 2900, a 2950, and a 2960. I checked the configuration register on all 3 of them, and it would not let me change the config register on all of them. They're preset to always boot off the flash. However, the router that I have emulated here for this internet gateway does let you change the config register. On any Cisco device, if you do show version, and you go all the way to the bottom of the version summary here, you'll see a line that says configuration register is, and in the case of routers and switches where you can change the config register, it is 2102. And basically that magic number means look on the flash for your iOS and your config file and boot the config file that you find there. Now, setting the configuration register incorrectly can cause all kinds of interesting things to happen. You can tell the router to not load the iOS. You can tell the router to use a different baud rate and serial configuration for its console port. And on devices that have more than one flash drive, you have flash 0, flash 1, or flash 2, for example, you can tell the router which flash drive to look on for its booting configuration. Now, you change the configuration register in global config mode just like you change any other configuration directive. So if we go into config mode and do config register, we hit question mark, that's all the help we get. Hey, what do you want to set the configuration register to? Now, the 2 settings that you'll generally use, other than the default of 2102, which is to boot off of the default flash drive, is you can set the config register to 0 or 1. If you set it to 0, the router will boot into ROMmon mode, which is used for password recovery, which you'll see elsewhere in the course. Setting it to 1 will tell it to boot from the ROM, but not actually load the configuration. Any other settings besides that will change the serial configuration and will change other various boot options for the switch, and I wouldn't recommend playing with this unless Cisco tells you to. There's several websites, both from Cisco and from third parties, that will detail all of the various bit settings inside this config register and what they actually do. That is well beyond the scope of the CCENT. Just suffice it to say that you can change the config register here. In fact, we will change the config register to be 0x0. And we'll write this config. And now if we do a show version, go all the way down to the bottom here, we see that the configuration register didn't change. And that's simply because this is an emulated router. Normally, this configuration register shows you what the setting will be for the next boot. If I had an actual hardware router here, I could change it and reboot it and show you that it just boots into ROMmon mode. If you have a physical router, you're not going to break your router so long as you eventually set the configuration register back to 2102. The other command that can be used to control the boot process on routers and switches is the boot command. So if we go into config mode and we do boot, hit question mark, we can tell the router a specific image file to load on boot up. Or you can say go on the network and pull a config file and a boot image down from the network. You normally only use the boot command if you happen to have more than one copy of the iOS on your flash. Certain large switches has enough flash on them to hold multiple versions of the iOS. So if you're going to upgrade the iOS, you don't necessarily have to delete the old version. You can put the new version in there, change the boot parameter in the configuration here to point to the new image, reboot the switch to see, hey, does this new image actually read the old config and does it do what I expect it to do before deleting the old version? Now, if you don't set this, the router will look on the flash and will pick the first file that it finds in alphabetical order, which, since most bin files, most iOS files, have the version number in the file name, it will automatically boot the oldest iOS on the machine. One thing I found out that is if you specify the boot command here in the configuration and that file is not there, then you can have unpredictable results. Certain chassis switches just won't boot at all. It says, hey, I can't find this file. You told me to load this file. I'm just going to go into ROMmon mode. Other smaller models of switches and routers will actually look and try to find a file on the flash if it can't find the one that you specify in the configuration. I think the second behavior is more logical than the first, but then again, I'm not a systems programmer at Cisco, so what do I know? So that covers the Cisco boot parameters, and that concludes our discussion of said Cisco boot parameters.